What's up everyone, and welcome back to my Echoes of Time channel. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button today. Let's get started. How an average Spartan lived. The army of ancient Sparta was one of the most famous and powerful fighting forces of its time. The military machine controlled practically every part of daily life. From the time they were born until the time they died, they served the state and its military. Spartans were expected to be perfect in both society and on the battlefield. Their society worked like a military force, teaching men and women how to be the best they could be for any problems they faced. Girls wrestled, worked out, and shaped themselves into powerful, graceful beings, while boys were beaten, famished, and turned into soldiers. They were not only romantic relationships, but they were also the basis of the Spartan state. Sparta was the most important thing to the people, and marriage was the second most important thing. It was important to win, and losing was not an option. If a newborn didn't pass inspection, it was left to die. The Spartans had no trouble killing babies, even though democracy started in Greece. In Sparta, every baby was taken to an inspection council. If the inspection uncovered any physical abnormalities or weaknesses that would make the baby unable to be a soldier, it was okay for it to die. There are stories that say the abandoned babies were thrown into a chasm, but it's more probable that they were left in the hills or the woods so that they wouldn't be seen or taken in by others. Kids didn't get very kind treatment. Even if Spartan society approved of the baby's upbringing, it may not have been a happy one. When kids cried, they were either ignored or punished. They encouraged kids not to be afraid of anything, even being alone. They couldn't wear shoes to toughen up their feet. As one of their first therapies, they really bathed neonates in wine to see how strong they were. People feared that children who were weaker would have seizures and die. Men had to serve in the military until they aged 60. Men had to join the army. They were taken away from their families and made to go through military training from the time they were 7 until they were about 21. There were other jobs besides being a soldier, but most men were soldiers. All men had to stay in the army reserve until they were 60. Soldiers ate together in military-style barracks. When a Spartan man turned 18, he was chosen to be a member of a syssitia, which was like a public mess hall. A soldier could apply to join a number of them, but only one would let him in. Once he became a member, he had to go every day unless he had a good excuse not to. Later, fathers took their kids there to learn about the culture and connect with the community. Only young people and boys were allowed to go. People thought it was wrong to be drunk. Spartans were expected to be both physically fit and mentally sharp. They liked wine in moderation, but drinking too much was not acceptable because it would make them less able to fight well mentally and physically. There was no accepting too much weight. To keep them from getting too heavy, Spartan kids could only wear one piece of clothes each year. If a kid got too big and outgrown their clothes, they couldn't get new ones. They had to either work out or eat less to maintain wearing the one piece of clothing that was given to them. To help people stay thin, the mess halls often served portions that were just a little less than filling. If a Spartan gained too much weight, they would be made fun of and maybe even kicked out of the country. Men couldn't live with their spouses until they were 30 years old. Men were supposed to live in military barracks until they turned 30, but marriage was common in Sparta, and couples had kids. To fully commit to the state and their military duties, they were prohibited from residing separately from their comrades. After they turned 30, soldiers could live anywhere they wanted. Men who were already married had to sneak out at night to be with their girlfriend. It was the government's policy to teach women. The Spartans did teach their people, but they didn't put much emphasis on philosophy. Most of the state-mandated instruction was about hard physical training. Even though women didn't have to serve in the military like men did, they still had to go through this kind of training. They could travel freely, unlike women in many parts of the ancient world who had to stay at home. It was embarrassing to be single. To keep its culture and way of life going, every society needs to make the next generation. Sparta needed to replace fallen warriors with new ones in order to stay alive as a civilization. Marriage was widely pushed because it meant having more kids. The major goal was to have more males, although any child was better than none. People made fun of men who didn't marry because they didn't support the government. Youngsters weren't allowed to stay youngsters for very long. At the age of 7, boys from Sparta were taken away from their families to join the agoge, a tough training program. Because of this hard instruction, they become brave soldiers. They learned a lot of things like how to hunt and fight. Even though they didn't have to do the same things, female Spartans learned gymnastics, dance, and javelin throwing to become strong moms. People who were weak were confused. Spartan children were often beaten for bad behavior. Seniors purposely provoked fights or grudges between the students to get rid of the weakest boys and find those who could be leaders. When a Spartan boy showed weakness, people looked down on him and hurt him. The top social class was the soldiers. In Sparta, social inequality was nothing new. The Spartiate was the highest class. It was made up of native Spartans who served in the army and had full political and legal privileges. The Perioeci, who were dealers and blacksmiths who created armor and weapons, were lower on the social ladder. Perioeci were often foreigners, even though they were free and could own land. The Helots were the lowest class. They were farmers and servants who did menial tasks. Women played sports and had their hair cut short. Helots worked for the more powerful Spartans, thus Spartan women didn't have to do most of the housework. They could also own land. If they weren't moms, women competed in singing, dancing, throwing, and wrestling. It was largely done to attract men, but it also helped them get ready to be moms. After they got married, Spartan women cut their hair short and shaved their heads. In a society where the military was not just a career but the very center of existence, influencing every moment from birth to death, the demands, expectations, and unrelenting discipline of the state defined life for the typical Spartan almost totally. A Spartan infant's life belonged to Sparta, not their parents, from the moment they breathed their first breath. This harsh reality was made evident during the infamous newborn inspections, where any physical weakness or perceived flaw could condemn a child to death, frequently by abandonment in the wilderness rather than the dramatic cliff-throwing later legends described. Because Spartan children were purposefully hardened by neglect, cruel treatment, and ongoing difficulties, infants were bathed in wine to test their strength, and wailing was either ignored or punished to remove fear and softness. Those who survived had a childhood that was anything but peaceful. Girls wrestled, ran, and trained to become strong mothers of warriors, while boys entered the agoge at the age of 7, leaving their families and starting a lifetime of military training, deprivation, and constant competition aimed at eradicating the weak and elevating the strong. As they grew older, boys and girls trained differently but were expected to become physically formidable. Boys were hungry to foster inventiveness, flogged for mistakes, pushed to their physical limitations, and made to suffer planned battles that revealed natural leaders. They also learned hunting, endurance, and unarmed warfare. While this culture promoted toughness, it also imposed severe restrictions on daily life. Children were only allowed to wear one piece of clothing per year, and if they became too large for it, they were supposed to lose weight through discipline rather than be given new clothes. Adult men who allowed themselves to become overweight were ridiculed or even banished. Spartan men were forced into military service until they were 60 years old, and they lived in barracks rather than private homes for the majority of their lives. They were only allowed to apply for membership in a syssitia, a private communal mess hall, after they turned 18. There, they ate simple meals, frequently insufficient, to avoid indulgence and maintain the lean, hardened physique that Sparta required. In order to maintain the image that state devotion came before personal preferences, even married men were prohibited from living with their wives until they turned 30. As a result, many husbands turned to sneaking out at night to spend time with their wives. Marriage, however, was by no means optional. It was viewed as a civic obligation that was essential to the army's future, and single men were publicly humiliated for not making contributions to the state. The government required Spartan women, unlike other women in antiquity, to undergo formal education and training in order to become resilient citizens and strong, healthy mothers who could take care of their homes and land while the men were abroad. They were not required to study philosophy like the elite men of Athens. After marriage, women cut their hair short as a symbolic act signifying their new position in society, and they were allowed to travel freely, own property, and compete in sports. However, beneath this well-organized hierarchy was the glaring class divide that kept Spartan life going. At the top were the Spartiates, who were both soldiers and full citizens, the Perioeci, who were free non-citizens who made weapons, armor, and other goods, and the Helots, a class of oppressed agricultural workers who farmed the land and did much of the physical labor that allowed Spartans to concentrate solely on war. Particularly during the Cryptia, when young Spartan males were encouraged to kill Helots in order to keep them afraid and obedient, the Helots lived in continual terror of violence, underscoring the sinister underbelly of a society that took pride in order and discipline. Despite this severity, the Spartans placed a surprising value on moderation, especially when it came to alcohol. Being intoxicated was viewed as a shameful weakness that was unfit for a warrior, and helots were occasionally purposefully made intoxicated in public as a warning of the humiliation and loss of self-control that Spartans must avoid. Concurrently, both boys and girls were taught to never be afraid of suffering, loneliness, or adversity, resulting in a population whose emotional fortitude was valued just as highly as their physical prowess. Their lives were controlled by obedience, discipline, and devotion to a Spartan ideal that superseded all individual aspirations. But this rigid way of life also produced strong bonds, close friendships, and a sense of obligation that bound citizens together over generations. The typical Spartan man spent almost all of his waking hours getting ready for battle, living in a community, exercising, drilling, and according to the strict rules of his syssitia, where attendance was required unless there was a valid reason, and meals prioritized group identity over individuality. Even fathers brought their sons to these communal messes to teach them Spartan principles, so participating in their rigorous upbringing. Freed from many household duties because helots handled the majority of the work, women gained economic power by managing and owning property, which was uncommon in the ancient world, and their athletic training, dancing, running, wrestling, and throwing javelins, was viewed as a means of preparing for motherhood and the state's survival rather than as entertainment. In a setting designed to develop exceptional soldiers at the expense of individual comfort, independence, and emotional expression, Spartan culture perpetuated the idea that weakness of body or mind was unacceptable and that anyone displaying softness or fear was ridiculed or punished. In the end, the typical Spartan lived a life characterized by selflessness, submission, and unshakable loyalty to the group, molded from birth into a member of a military apparatus whose might amazed the ancient world but required a high cost from its citizens.